In January 1863, the City of London achieved the impossible. They opened the Metropolitan Railway, the world's very first underground transit system. But this wasn't the clean electric subway you know today. This was a mechanical nightmare that defied every law of human survival. Imagine a Victorian gentleman in a pristine silk top hat descending into a pitch-black sealed brick tube to board a steam-powered train that breathed fire, blinding smoke, and lethal toxic gas. The concept is pure madness, yet it gave birth to the Metropolitan Railway. Spearheaded by the relentless visionary Charles Pearson, this was humanity's first attempt at a steam-powered underground transit system. But to understand this desperate gamble, you have to look up at the surface. Mid-Victorian London was suffocating. Over 3 million people were crammed into a medieval street plan, creating a gridlocked nightmare. Imagine standing at King's Cross. The air is thick with industrial soot, and the cobblestones are slick with thousands of tons of raw horse manure generated daily. The Thames River is essentially an open, rotting sewer breeding cholera, while the streets above are completely paralyzed by carts, cabs, and frantic pedestrians. You could walk across the city faster than a carriage could drive you. That is exactly why Pearson's radical idea wasn't just a luxury, it was a desperate escape hatch for a dying metropolis. He proposed taking the thundering, fire-belching steam locomotives of the era and burying them beneath the pavement. They weren't just building a train. The physics suggested they were building a highly efficient mass suffocation chamber. A steam engine requires immense oxygen to burn coal, and it violently expels lethal carbon monoxide, sulfur, and choking black smoke. Putting that beast inside a tightly sealed brick corridor violates every basic rule of human survival. So why did the government approve it? Because the slow strangulation on the surface was already claiming thousands of lives. The risk of the underground unknown felt marginally better than the guaranteed decay of the streets. It was the ultimate roll of the dice against human biology. Tell me right now in the comments, would you voluntarily step into a lightless, suffocating tunnel just to shave 30 minutes off your daily commute? But before they could even worry about the toxic air, they had to figure out how to build the tunnel without tearing the greatest city on Earth to shreds. And their solution? It was absolutely brutal. The Great Urban Scar: How They Redrew London. The underground is a lie. They didn't bore a neat little tunnel deep below the surface. They violently ripped the city's streets wide open. Forget the elegant, deep-level boring machines of the modern era. The engineers of the 1860s utilized a method known as cut and cover, which is exactly as destructive as it sounds. They essentially performed unanesthetized open-heart surgery on the capital of the British Empire. Armies of laborers, armed with nothing but pickaxes, shovels, and raw muscle, carved a colossal trench directly through the dense urban fabric. They dug a chasm 10 meters deep, constructed massive brick retaining walls on either side, arched a roof over the top, and then simply threw the displaced dirt back over the newly formed crypt. This wasn't a surgical operation, this was geographical trauma. Entire neighborhoods were marked for obliteration. The poorest citizens, particularly those residing in the notorious slums of the Fleet Valley, were unceremoniously evicted. Thousands were displaced without compensation, cast out into the already overflowing streets so the wealthy could have a faster route to the financial district. You think roadwork is annoying today? Imagine waking up to an apocalyptic crater swallowing your entire neighborhood. The psychological weight on the citizens was immense. Pedestrians had to navigate narrow, precarious wooden walkways suspended over gaping abysses. The deafening roar of falling masonry and the constant, choking dust became the new atmosphere of the city. London's veins were completely exposed to the open air. It was a terrifying display of industry's arrogance, proving that Victorian engineers viewed the Earth not as an obstacle, but as a material to be shattered and reshaped by brute force. Be honest. What would your reaction be if the city served you an eviction notice tomorrow because they needed to dig a massive railway trench straight through your living room? They thought they had conquered the city's geography, but they forgot that when you cut the earth open, sometimes the earth fights back. Part 3. The Hidden River Incident, a subterranean engineering disaster. June 1862, the ground began to rumble, a horrific stench filled the air, and then the retaining walls simply vanished. The engineers had underestimated the hidden anatomy of London. Beneath the chaotic streets flowed the Fleet River, an ancient waterway that centuries of urban development had transformed into a massive, pressurized subterranean sewer. It ran parallel to the newly excavated railway trenches, held back only by the confidence of Victorian brickwork. But confidence cannot hold back a swollen underground ocean of filth. Following days of torrential summer rain, the structural integrity of the newly built railway tunnels was pushed to the absolute breaking point. The soil liquefied. The pressure against the brick retaining walls grew completely unsustainable. First came the ominous cracking sounds echoing through the dark, unfinished corridors. Then, absolute chaos. A massive section of the brick vault gave way with a deafening roar. In seconds, the terrifying darkness of the tunnel was overwhelmed by a rushing, black tide of raw Victorian sewage and freezing river water. Workers deep in the trenches heard the monstrous sound before they saw the wave. It was a desperate, blind scramble in the pitch-black abyss, men desperately clawing their way up precarious wooden ladders as the foul deluge consumed the heavy machinery, the timber scaffolding, and months of grueling labor. Millions of pounds and years of agonizing labor were literally drowning in human waste. Was this the end of the line? The Metropolitan Railway Board was thrown into an absolute panic. The disaster site looked like a subterranean shipwreck. Critics of the project, who had long predicted that digging into the underworld would provoke a catastrophic reckoning, felt entirely vindicated. The press had a field day with the disaster, painting the entire endeavor as a cursed folly of arrogant men playing God with the earth. Imagine the pitch blackness, the roar of the rushing water echoing off the brickwork. How would you handle that level of sensory terror? It took months to pump out the sludge and salvage the brickwork, but as it turned out, the toxic water wasn't their biggest enemy. The air was. Part 4. Fowler's Ghost, the experimental engine that nearly ended everything. The engineers weren't stupid. They knew steam was a death sentence, so they built a technological marvel to save them, a smokeless train called Fowler's Ghost. The entire Metropolitan Railway Board, and specifically their brilliant chief engineer John Fowler, recognized the fatal flaw. Burning coal in a subterranean tube would choke the passengers, blind the drivers, and asphyxiate anyone unfortunate enough to be working in the stations. The public press was already howling about the terrifying prospect of the dark descent, warning that to travel on such a contraption would invite asphyxia. So Fowler, under immense pressure, conceptualized what was supposed to be the ultimate triumph of Victorian thermodynamics. He aimed to construct an engine that did not actively burn its fuel underground, but instead stored an immense volume of heat to carry the train through the tunnels without emitting a single plume of smoke. Fowler's Ghost was not a traditional steam beast. It was a bizarre, heavily armored tank of an engine. The concept was theoretically brilliant. The locomotive would be brought to a white-hot boil above ground, filling the massive boiler with extreme pressure. Inside the firebox, instead of a roaring coal fire, they stacked a massive block of specialized fire bricks. These bricks were preheated to incandescence at the terminus. The thermodynamic logic was sound on paper. The glowing bricks would slowly release their intense stored thermal energy, keeping the water boiling and generating enough steam pressure to pull the heavy wooden carriages through the 3.5-mile journey to the end of the line. It was a thermodynamic masterpiece on paper, but physics doesn't care about paper. When the massive, revolutionary machine was finally ready for its first major trial run inside the tunnels, the investors held their breath. Fowler was confident, but as the immense weight of the engine and the carriages began to grind forward, the theoretical thermal transfer rate failed spectacularly. The fire bricks simply could not generate enough consistent, immediate heat to replace the rapidly escaping steam pressure. By the time it reached the halfway point, the engine was crawling. It hissed, sputtered, and finally rolled to a pathetic, embarrassing halt in the dead center of the dark tunnel. The pressure gauge had dropped to 0. Have you ever spent years working on a massive project only for it to fail miserably on day one? Now imagine doing that in front of the entire British Empire. Fowler's ghost was dead on arrival. The grand opening was looming, and the smokeless train was a failure. If the smokeless train failed, what the hell did they actually use on opening day?
They didn't solve the smoke problem, they just hid it. And they did it using one of the most dangerous rudimentary engineering hacks of the century. With the utter failure of Fowler's ghost and the grand opening of the Metropolitan Railway fast approaching, panic set in among the directors. They had a fully built tunnel and absolutely no way to run a train through it without asphyxiating the paying public. So they abandoned the dream of true smokeless travel and turned to a brutal compromise. They adopted condensing engines, an old concept that was terrifyingly repurposed for the tight, unventilated subterranean confines. The core mechanism was violently simple. Normal steam locomotives blast their exhaust, a mixture of steam and toxic smoke, straight up through the chimney to create a draft for the fire. In the newly designed engines for the underground, this exhaust was forcibly diverted. Large, thick pipes were fitted to the front of the locomotive, routing the spent, hissing steam backward. Instead of escaping into the air, it was blasted directly into massive cold water tanks mounted on the sides of the engine. The cold water would rapidly cool the steam, condensing it back into a liquid state and preventing it from filling the brick vault above them. It kept the tunnels from becoming completely opaque, but it secretly turned them into an invisible chemical bath. Because while the steam was condensed, the actual fire was still burning. The engineers mandated the use of coke, a form of processed smokeless coal, instead of raw bituminous coal. While coke produced significantly less visible black soot, it still emitted lethal, invisible gases, particularly carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide. So the giant beasts would plunge into the dark, frantically pumping steam into their side tanks, while simultaneously leaking acrid, choking fumes that accumulated in the still, stagnant air of the tunnels. It was a terrifying band-aid applied to a fundamental design flaw. Here is the ultimate Victorian dilemma. Could you endure a daily 30-minute commute trapped in a dimly lit, sulfur-choked carriage, or would you take your chances with the cholera-ridden streets above? Armed with this flawed, toxic compromise, the engineers crossed their fingers. Opening day had arrived, and there was no turning back. Part 6. Opening Day, 1863. 30,000 Londoners gathered at the precipice of a dark hole, driven by pure, unadulterated FOMO. The tension in the air was palpable, thicker than the Thames fog. On January 9th, a massive VIP banquet was held in the Subterranean Farringdon Street station. It was a lavish affair, illuminated by glaring gaslight, designed solely to prove to the jittery investors and the skeptical press that the air below ground was perfectly safe to breathe while consuming turtle soup. The following day, January 10th, the Metropolitan Railway officially opened its doors to the public. The response was not a trickle of curious onlookers, it was a tidal wave. Over 30,000 people fought their way to the ticket booths. The sheer novelty of the concept, the audacity of riding a train beneath the sewers, had triggered an absolute frenzy of fear of missing out. The descent was a cinematic sequence of psychological whiplash. Passengers, dressed in thick wool and stiff collars, marched down the steep gaslit staircases into the cool, damp earth. The platforms were vast brick caverns echoing with the terrifying guttural roar of the approaching condensing engine.
As the massive iron beast tore out of the tunnel mouth, hissing and spitting, the crowd recoiled. Then they stepped aboard the luxurious gas-lit wooden carriages. The doors slammed shut, the whistle shrieked, and they plunged into the total darkness of the brick vault. They stepped into the abyss expecting hell, but found a carnival of Victorian progress. It was a flawless victory. Or so they thought. The sensation of moving seamlessly, powerfully beneath the chaotic, gridlocked streets of London was instantly intoxicating. The brutal journey from Paddington to Farringdon Street, which would take over an hour of agonizing, bumpy horse-drawn traffic, was utterly annihilated in just 18 minutes. The passengers emerged on the other side, blinking in the daylight, their faces streaked with a fine layer of soot, but utterly exhilarated. They had survived the dark descent, and they had moved faster than any human had ever moved across a dense city. The sheer triumph of the experience completely overrode the underlying anxiety. Put yourself in their shoes in 1863. Would you be the first in line for this alien technology, or would you wait to see if the first train actually came back out? The honeymoon phase was intoxicating, but the novelty was about to violently collide with a biological wall.
Part 7. The Great Victorian Deception, the secret fight for clean air. The Metropolitan Railway had a PR problem. Their passengers and drivers were literally suffocating. Their solution? Bribe doctors to say the toxic air was actually a medical cure. The honeymoon phase of underground travel was brutally short-lived. By the late 1860s, it became undeniably clear that the rudimentary condensing engines were failing to mask the grim scientific reality of underground air. A train passing through the tunnel didn't just leave behind a faint odor, it left behind a thick, stagnant, and highly dangerous chemical miasma. Sulfur dioxide violently stung the eyes, heavy carbon dioxide rapidly replaced the breathable oxygen, and the immense ambient heat radiating from the massive boilers baked the unventilated, sealed brick tunnels to sweltering, unbearable temperatures. Train drivers, forced to work grueling 12-hour shifts in this subterranean oven, were routinely passing out at the controls. Guards and conductors would emerge into the daylight at the end of the line, physically ill, violently coughing up thick black phlegm. The initial awe of the paying public rapidly devolved into a creeping, claustrophobic dread. People were slowly realizing they were paying for the privilege of sitting inside a low-level chemical bath. The press began publishing terrifying, sensationalized accounts of choke damp filling the carriages and fainting passengers collapsing on the platforms. But the railway executives were sitting on an absolute goldmine. They couldn't afford to halt operations, and they certainly didn't want to spend fortunes on massive experimental ventilation shafts. So they launched one of the most audacious, cynical public relations cover-ups of the 19th century. They leaned heavily on the Victorian medical establishment. Instead of fixing the deadly air, the company funded strategic research that aggressively spun the suffocating smoke as a positive health benefit. They actually published claims stating that the sulfurous fumes were a highly therapeutic treatment for asthma, bronchitis, and other severe respiratory ailments. Your eyes are watering, your lungs are burning, but the poster on the wall tells you you're getting healthier. It was pure, unadulterated corporate gaslighting. They masterfully leveraged the Victorian obsession with bizarre medical cures to convince an entire population to simply ignore their own biological warning signs. They told the public that the coughing was just the healing vapors doing their job. Do you think modern corporations still use these exact same gaslighting tactics today to hide fatal flaws in their new technology? The lie couldn't last forever. As the air grew thicker, they realized the tunnels were becoming toxic traps. They had to mutate the city once again. They didn't just build a transit system, they built a geographic centrifuge that physically rewired the population of the largest city on Earth. Before the invention of the Metropolitan Railway, London was a densely packed, inescapable cage. You lived exactly where you worked, for the simple reason that walking was the only reliable, affordable mode of mass transit. If you were an industrial laborer, you were permanently trapped in the cramped, disease-ridden slums immediately surrounding the factories. But the Subterranean Railway completely shattered that geographical prison. It unleashed a tidal wave of explosive urban expansion. The railway monopoly quickly realized that laying more track directly equated to printing more money. They pushed outward with ruthless efficiency, developing the district line and meticulously constructing the massive inner circle to link the giant mainline terminus stations, Paddington, Euston, and King's Cross. Every new mile of track required evicting more citizens and digging more trenches, but the result was a complete rewiring of human society. This sheer scale of ambition birthed an entirely new species of human, the modern commuter. For the very first time, property developers could build housing miles away from the industrial center. The working and middle classes finally had a mechanical escape route from the slums. They could board a steam train in the relatively clean air of the newly formed suburbs and be transported directly into the financial and industrial heart of the capital in minutes. The railway was acting as a giant vacuum, literally sucking people out of the overcrowded, toxic center and spinning them outwards into the ever-expanding edges of the metropolis. The sprawling, interconnected suburban layout of modern London is a direct physical result of these early brick tunnels. For the first time in human history, where you slept and where you worked could be two completely different worlds. It gave millions of people their lives, their health, and their time back. It was the ultimate liberation, disguised as a noisy public transit project. Think about your own commute. How much of your daily life is entirely dependent on this 160-year-old concept of moving underground? It was an economic triumph, but this massive, relentless expansion pushed the archaic steam technology to its absolute, catastrophic breaking point.
Part 9. The end of the steam era. The invention of the deep-level tube. Steam was a magnificent beast, but underground it was a dinosaur waiting for the asteroid. And that asteroid was the Great Head Shield. The relentless, highly profitable expansion of the Victorian underground had finally hit a physical wall. The brutal cut-and-cover method, which involved destroying everything on the surface just to dig a shallow trench, was simply too destructive to sustain. As the city grew exponentially denser, buying up prime, incredibly expensive real estate just to demolish it became financially suicidal. The only logical way forward was to go much, much deeper. They had to dive far below the sewers, the building foundations, and the buried rivers. They needed true, deep-level tunnels bored silently and invisibly through the solid London clay. And this is exactly where the great paradox of the steam age was brutally exposed. Engineers introduced the Great Head Shield, a monumental piece of mechanical boring technology. This massive iron cylinder allowed workers to safely carve perfectly circular tubes deep within the earth without ever disturbing the busy streets above. But this incredible innovation revealed a terrifying reality. You physically cannot run a fire-breathing, massive oxygen-consuming steam engine inside a tight, deep-level tube without instantly suffocating every single soul aboard. The shallow, cut-and-cover tunnels of the 1860s had just enough ambient airspace and occasional open-air cuttings to prevent immediate mass death. A deep-level tube, however, is essentially a sealed vacuum. The very success of the underground had rendered its core technology utterly obsolete. The Metropolitan Railway had successfully proven to the world that subterranean mass transit was the future of civilization, but their massive, heavy, smoke-belching locomotives were now holding that exact future hostage. The workers, who had spent decades inhaling sulfur and constantly wiping oily soot from their eyes, were exhausted. The twilight of the steam giants had officially arrived. A sense of nostalgia mixed with immense breathing relief began to wash over the city as the limitations of fire and water became completely undeniable. Progress always demands a sacrifice. What piece of everyday technology do you think we will look back on in 50 years and say, "I can't believe we actually used that"? The era of fire, smoke, and water had to be dragged out and executed, so the silent, glowing era of electricity could be born. But here is the most baffling part of the entire Metropolitan experiment. If the tunnels were truly a chemical cocktail of sulfur, carbon monoxide, and soot, why weren't the platforms littered with corpses? Why didn't the death trap actually kill people by the thousands? The answer lies in a grim biological irony. The citizens of Victorian London were already preconditioned for hell. You have to realize that the fresh air on the surface wasn't fresh at all. This was the era of the pea supers, thick, yellow industrial fogs so dense you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Londoners had been inhaling coal smoke, horse manure dust, and industrial chemicals since the day they were born. Their lungs weren't pristine organs, they were reinforced by a lifetime of atmospheric trauma. To a modern human, the air in the 1863 Underground would feel like a physical assault. To a Victorian clerk, it was just Tuesday. The human body possesses a terrifying ability to adapt to slow-motion catastrophe. While there were no mass casualty events from suffocation, the death trap was operating on a much more subtle, a much more cynical timeline. It wasn't an instant execution chamber, it was a tax on long-term health. The drivers and guards, the men who spent 12 hours a day in that sulfurous abyss, didn't drop dead at the controls. Instead, they developed the black spit. They suffered from chronic bronchitis and premature aging, their respiratory systems slowly turning into charcoal. The railway didn't kill you today, it just stole 10 years from your future. It was a calculated trade-off that defines the entire industrial revolution. The Victorian mind was uniquely suited for this gamble. They prioritized the economy of time over the sanctity of the body. If the train could get you to work faster, the stinging eyes and the coughing fits were simply the price of progress. They weren't dying in the tunnels because they were already living in a citywide gas chamber. Tell me honestly, if you knew a technology was shaving years off your life expectancy, but it was the only way to survive in a hyper-competitive world, would you still use it? We think we're different, but look at the blue light of our screens and the microplastics in our water. The Metropolitan Railway didn't prove that the air was safe. It proved that humanity's hunger for speed and efficiency is more powerful than our basic instinct for survival. But as the tunnels went deeper and the steam grew thicker, even the iron lungs of the Victorians reached a breaking point. The era of fire and water had to be dragged out and executed so the silent, glowing era of electricity could be born. Every time you swipe your card to enter the subway, whether in New York, Tokyo, Paris, or Kiev, you owe that journey to a group of crazy Victorians who decided to light a fire in a sealed pipe. The legacy of 1863 stretches far beyond the borders of Britain. The Metropolitan Railway was the ultimate terrifying proof of concept for global urbanization. Before Charles Pearson and his engineering team forced a roaring steam locomotive beneath the cobblestones, the very idea of a subterranean city was considered a literal descent into hell. It was the realm of the dead, not a place for the living. They completely shattered that psychological barrier forever. Today, the modern London Underground, along with the sprawling, illuminated electric transit maps of every major city on Earth, acts as the vital artery of the modern world. It processes millions of souls daily in near-perfect silence, a stark, almost unimaginable contrast to the deafening, choking brutality of its origins. But none of this pristine, high-tech infrastructure would exist without that initial desperate gamble. The algorithms of modern city planning, the high-density co-occurrence of global financial hubs, and the sheer overwhelming scale of modern megacities all rely heavily on the subterranean foundation laid by these ruthless pioneers. They looked at a paralyzed, diseased city and chose to inflict massive geographical trauma simply to save it. They accepted the toxic air, the horrifying structural collapses, and the sheer primal terror of the unknown underground. They didn't just conquer the dirt beneath their feet, they conquered the concept of distance itself. It is a soaring tribute to human audacity. We are not a species that passively accepts the physical limitations of our environment. When the surface becomes utterly uninhabitable, we don't retreat, we simply redefine where the surface is. From the soot-stained brickwork of the 19th century to the glowing, silent networks of the 21st, the lineage is unbroken. Next time you ride the metro, close your eyes for a second. Listen to the rails and try to imagine the smell of the steam. We are a species that looks at the dark, choking earth and decides, against all logic and sanity, to carve veins of light and motion straight through the abyss.